It was a bright, sunny afternoon, the kind where everything seems perfect, and the scent of fresh grass fills the air. Yet, as I stepped outside to admire the elaborate sandcastles I had meticulously crafted in my yard, something felt off. I didn't know if it was the sudden chill in the air or the strange silence that hung over the neighborhood. A quick glance around showed no one. No cars driving by, no kids playing, just the unsettling quiet of suburban life. But then I saw her. Karen, my neighbor, standing at the edge of my driveway, staring at my yard with eyes full of judgment, as if my sandcastles had somehow offended her entire existence. She was clutching a clipboard, her face as tight as a drum, her expression as though she had witnessed the greatest crime of all time. And before I could even ask if she needed something, she marched over to me, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. What was going on? I had spent hours building these sandcastles. They were harmless, just a way to escape the monotony of my everyday life. But Karen clearly didn't see it that way. Her eyes narrowed as she approached. "You can't just build sandcastles here," she said, the words coming out like venom. I stood frozen, not sure if I had heard her correctly. Sandcastles? In my own yard? This was my space, my property, my freedom. But Karen, with her sense of entitlement and her perpetual desire to control everything around her, wasn't about to let something as trivial as a personal hobby get in the way of her desire to police the neighborhood. I tried to explain that I was just having a little fun, that the sandcastles were a creative outlet. But it was clear she wasn't listening. Her eyes flared with something resembling outrage. Then, to my utter disbelief, she whipped out her phone and began dialing. "I'm calling the authorities," she said. "This is an offense. You're causing a disturbance, and I'm not going to let this slide." My mind raced. Authorities? For sandcastles? Was she serious? I had no idea what kind of twisted logic she was using, but there was no way I was going to let this woman dictate what I did on my own property. I watched her dial 911, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. It was as if my whole existence had been flipped upside down. What was about to happen? Would the police show up? Could Karen really get me arrested for building too many sandcastles? The questions flooded my mind as the phone rang, and I steeled myself for what would surely be an absurd showdown. The seconds felt like hours as I stood there, watching Karen's fingers nervously tap the phone, waiting for someone on the other end to pick up. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend how things had spiraled to this point. It was just sand, after all, sand that I had placed with my own hands to create something beautiful, something that had no harm to anyone. Yet, in Karen's world, it was a crime. I could see her fuming, standing there like a self-appointed enforcer of some ridiculous rule that no one else cared about. The phone call wasn't just about sandcastles anymore. It was about her need to assert control over every inch of the neighborhood. In that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary confrontation. She wasn't just upset, she was on a mission. I tried to keep my calm, telling myself that I could handle whatever was coming. But as the minutes dragged on, the reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just about sandcastles or a silly dispute. This was about power, Karen wielding whatever authority she thought she had, and I was in the crossfire. The phone call ended with a sharp click, and she turned to face me, her expression now filled with a mixture of satisfaction and righteous anger. "They'll be here soon," she said, and I could see the gleam in her eyes as if she had already won. I stood still, trying to make sense of it all. It felt like something straight out of a bad comedy, but as I glanced toward the street, I noticed the approaching sirens in the distance. It wasn't just Karen and her delusions of grandeur now. The real authority was coming, and the possibility of being arrested for a sandcastle was becoming all too real. My pulse quickened as the flashing lights grew closer. Was this truly happening? Was I about to face the police for something so trivial, so absurd? But even as the sirens grew louder, something inside me clicked. I wasn't going to let this happen. I wasn't going to let Karen win. This was my yard, my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let anyone tell me what I could and couldn't do with it. As the police cars pulled up, I took a deep breath, preparing for what would come next. I had no idea how this would play out, but one thing was clear: I was in for the fight of my life. The two police cruisers rolled to a stop, their flashing lights painting the quiet suburban street in an eerie glow. I stood frozen for a moment, taking in the surreal sight of the situation. In the middle of a peaceful neighborhood, two police cars had just pulled up to a property where Sandcastles were the alleged crime. The officers stepped out, their faces unreadable, as if they had seen everything, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to walk into. Karen, standing beside them, looked every bit the part of a person who had just summoned the forces of law and order to confront a dire threat to society. I could feel the weight of the moment settle in. My peaceful yard, which had been nothing more than a canvas for creativity, had now become the center of a chaotic spectacle. The officers glanced at Karen, then back at me, their eyes scanning the scene as if they were trying to make sense of the absurdity before them. It was as though they couldn't believe they had to be here, as though they were mentally preparing themselves to sort out some sort of childish dispute. The heavy tension was palpable, and I could feel my nerves starting to tighten. What was going to happen next? Would they really arrest me for something so trivial? My mind raced, replaying every moment that had led up to this point, every letter, every message from Karen, every argument she had tried to push onto me. I had never imagined that my small, harmless hobby of building sandcastles could lead to a showdown with the law, but here I was, the absurdity of it all taking hold. The officers exchanged glances, and I could see that they weren't convinced by Karen's story, but they were still here, still obligated to do something. I could hear Karen's voice rise, repeating her claims, her frustration bleeding through her words. It felt as though she was pushing harder with every sentence, trying to make her case more urgent, more damning. But despite her efforts, the officers remained distant, detached. They weren't buying into her hysteria, at least not fully. As the silence stretched, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this situation would unravel itself in my favor. But then, the older officer took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly at me. His gaze was hard, professional, and yet there was something else beneath the surface, something that told me he wasn't interested in getting dragged into a petty argument. The younger officer, standing a bit further off, kept glancing back at Karen, as though waiting for her to take the lead. My thoughts churned, and I realized that the outcome of this confrontation was far from certain. What were they going to do? Could Karen force them to side with her? Would I be dragged into some ridiculous arrest for simply expressing myself in my own yard? The tension hung thick in the air, and I could feel the weight of every second as it stretched on, uncertain and unsettling. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as the silence between us stretched on. The older officer finally broke the stillness, stepping closer, his eyes scanning my yard as if he was trying to process what was happening. I could see the confusion flicker in his expression, and for the first time since the police arrived, I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't just the tension of the moment, it was the fact that, for all Karen's bluster, the officers were still human. They didn't look like people who had ever dealt with a situation like this before, and that gave me a small sense of control. But even as the officer examined my sandcastles, I could see the doubt settling in. He looked at me, then back at Karen, his stance slightly relaxing, as if he was slowly beginning to understand just how absurd this whole thing was. I watched as Karen's expression shifted, from the confident belief that she had the upper hand to a quick flash of panic. It was clear that she wasn't used to people questioning her authority. But the officers didn't seem to share her view. The younger officer stood a little farther off, his eyes flicking from the sandcastles to the street, as if he was already mentally distancing himself from the absurdity of the situation. And then, as if to confirm my growing sense of hope, the older officer turned and nodded to his partner, signaling him to step back. I could almost feel the power shift in the air, like the calm after a storm. It was clear now that they weren't going to arrest me. The sheer ridiculousness of the situation was starting to take hold, even for the law enforcement officers who had been called to the scene. But Karen wasn't done. Her gaze remained fixed on the officers, her body stiff with indignation, her hands twitching as though she was waiting for a sign of support from them. She wasn't going to give up so easily. I could tell she was still desperate to have the last word, to make sure that I felt the full weight of her self-appointed authority. Yet, despite her attempts to dominate the situation, the officers weren't buying it. The younger officer seemed to deflate a little, his posture relaxing as he realized that his presence here wasn't needed for something as trivial as Sandcastles. But it wasn't just the officers who seemed to be coming around. The neighbors had started to gather at the edges of the street, watching the unfolding drama. Their expressions were mixed, some curious, some confused, but most of them silently observing, perhaps wondering how this could even be happening. As I looked over at them, I could see their eyes shifting toward Karen, the unease beginning to spread through the crowd. I had been the outsider in this neighborhood, the one who had built something that didn't fit in with the picture-perfect image Karen tried to enforce. But now, in the face of her absurdity, it was becoming clear that I wasn't alone. The power that Karen had held for so long was beginning to wane. Her grip on the situation was slipping, and as the minutes passed, the scales of justice seemed to tip ever so slightly in my favor. This wasn't over yet, but I felt a sense of momentum building, a sense that this absurd confrontation wasn't going to end with my arrest but with something much more satisfying. The officers, clearly more focused on the absurdity of the situation than Karen's demands, began to move away from the Sandcastles, their attention now shifting back to the crowd that had gathered in the street. It was as though they had been waiting for something, an event, a moment that would allow them to break free from this strange, twisted drama. They exchanged a few more glances, the older officer holding my property in his hands as he flipped through the documents I had been carrying all along. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The air was thick with the weight of the moment, the tension palpable, but there was a shift happening now. It was subtle at first, just the smallest ripple in the crowd's demeanor, but it was unmistakable. The once innocent bystanders, who had watched from their windows and driveways, now seemed to be taking sides. Whispers began to spread among them, their eyes shifting from Karen, who stood rigid with fury, to me, who stood still but increasingly confident. It was as if the veil had been lifted, and for the first time, they saw Karen for what she truly was, a woman who had made a mountain out of a molehill, a person whose authority was built on petty control rather than genuine concern for the neighborhood. The officers stood silently for a moment longer, allowing the weight of the situation to sink in. I could see the frustration in Karen's face as she realized that her grip on the situation was slipping. The officers hadn't arrested me. They hadn't even given her the satisfaction of reprimanding me. Instead, they had taken the time to review the evidence, to see the bigger picture, and in doing so, they had made it clear that Karen's crusade had no real foundation. It wasn't just the officers who were beginning to understand. The onlookers, who had been hesitant to get involved, were now beginning to murmur among themselves, their faces slowly showing signs of disapproval toward Karen's actions. I saw one neighbor glance at another, nodding in silent agreement. It was as if a shift had occurred in the collective mindset of the community, a quiet rebellion against the woman who had long been the self-appointed sheriff of their neighborhood. The once tight grip she held over her little corner of the world was unraveling in front of her eyes. Her every attempt to assert control had backfired. Her attempts to drag me into a confrontation with the law had only exposed her for the petty, power-hungry figure she truly was. And as the realization hit her, I could see the cracks in her confidence begin to show. It was in the way she clenched her jaw, her fists at her sides, and the way her eyes flicked from the officers to me, and then to the ever-growing crowd. She had lost. And yet, she wasn't ready to admit it. As the officers prepared to leave, one last parting shot from her seemed inevitable, but the damage had already been done. The entire community had seen her for who she was, and no amount of rage or threats could change that now. The tension that had once filled the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet triumph that settled over me like a weight lifted from my shoulders. As the officers turned and walked back to their vehicles, I could feel the weight of the moment sinking in. This absurd saga was finally coming to an end, but it felt like more than just a personal victory. It was as though I had struck a blow not only for my own dignity but for everyone who had been quietly suffering under Karen's reign of control. The neighborhood was waking up to the truth, and though the outcome had been in my favor, it was clear that the shift in the community would have lasting effects. The crowd of neighbors, who had once silently observed, now stood in small groups, some exchanging glances, others nodding as if to acknowledge that the balance of power had changed. The fear that had once kept them at arm's length from me, fear of retribution from Karen, seemed to be melting away, replaced by a sense of solidarity. For the first time, they weren't afraid of standing up for what was right, and the seed of resistance had been planted. Karen, standing in the middle of it all, looked utterly defeated, her fury giving way to disbelief as the last of the officers climbed into their cruisers and drove off. The silence that followed felt strange, almost surreal, but it was a silence of liberation, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. People who had once avoided me in the street now gave me small nods of acknowledgement. They had witnessed the whole ordeal unfold, and though no one had directly intervened, they had all seen Karen for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind an illusory shield of authority. The shift was subtle at first, but I knew it would grow. Word would spread quickly, and Karen's power would diminish with each passing day. I could already imagine the conversations taking place behind closed doors, neighbors discussing the events, comparing notes, and slowly realizing they had been living in fear of a woman who had no real power. As for Karen, I could see the defeat in her eyes as she turned and stormed back to her house, her once proud stance now crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. The chapter was over for her, but it wasn't quite over for me. The victory wasn't just about beating Karen, it was about proving that, in the end, the truth always comes out. And sometimes, the most ridiculous of situations can spark the most profound of changes. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over my yard, I took one last look at the Sandcastles. The fight had been absurd, yes, but it had also been necessary. Not just for my peace of mind, but for everyone who had silently endured the oppressive rule of someone who thought they had the right to control every aspect of their lives. My yard was mine again, and this time, it felt like more than just a patch of earth. It felt like freedom.